Joining us now, resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and director of Realign for Palestine, Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, counselor for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and MSNBC foreign affairs analyst and author of Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World, Ambassador Dennis Ross, and Susan Glasser, still sticking around with us. Susan, starting with you, let's talk Trump's stance here on this conflict. In your latest reporting, you say that casting this as merely just a flip-flop of a noted flip-flopper strikes me as a bit beside the point. So what is this? What is the point here?
Yeah, look, first of all, let's say very clearly that Donald Trump came to office promising that he could essentially click his heels and order the conflicts to cease in both Gaza and Ukraine. That hasn't happened. The world is a complicated place. I also think it's very important to underscore that in many ways, Trump bears a certain amount of responsibility for especially these horrible pictures that he's seeing on television ever since the ceasefire broke down and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pulled out of the ceasefire in March. You haven't heard Donald Trump ordering him, to increase the humanitarian aid into Gaza. You haven't heard Donald Trump exercising the United States' very considerable amount of leverage over Israel to pressure Israel to bring an end to the conflict. You haven't heard Donald Trump talking about the fact that, IDF officials have very consistently said military goals such as they were able to achieve have been achieved in this conflict. No, Donald Trump is only now reacting in the way that he does as a creature of the media to these images on television. But I think it's really a big oversimplification to just look at this as some kind of a break with Netanyahu, because he still hasn't essentially broken with the Israeli government. And frankly, I don't anticipate that he'll do so. The question is whether he can exert pressure publicly or privately, get more humanitarian aid going. But I don't see that we've made some kind of definitive break in this past week or some sharp change in American policy. If anything, I think we're omitting from the conversation the extent to which Trump and his government bear some part of the responsibility for these horrible images that we're seeing.
Ahmed, to you, you grew up in Gaza and you lost family in this war, as I understand it. In your latest piece for The Atlantic, you write, Hamas actually wants a famine in Gaza. Producing mass death from hunger is the group's final play, its last hope for ending the war in a way that advances its goals. Explain that to us. Can you explain why Hamas may think this is an effective tool of war?
Well, multiple things can be true at once. It is a fact that the Israeli government, through its policies, through the directions of far-right Finance Minister Smotrich, are ultimately responsible for reducing the supply of food inventory in Gaza down to a trickle starting in March. Nevertheless, they very much so fell into a trap of Hamas's design. Hamas wanted to see the deterioration of the humanitarian conditions in Gaza, knowing full well that this may be the only hope for drawing in the international community, for producing horrendous imagery that showcase the war as being a humanitarian catastrophe, and therefore hoping to bring about a rapid end to the war that it started and it has an ultimate responsibility to end. I think for sure Hamas has had a role in siphoning off plenty of the aid going in. Hamas has gotten us to a place where we need GHF. I'm not saying I support GHF, but we need to even have the conversation about an alternate mechanism other than the UN. And that needs to be talked about, even if we hold Israel ultimately responsible.
And GHF has said that it has distributed upwards of 90 million to 100 million meals so far, so it's not insignificant. Ahmed, how do you see Israel's policy, the U.S. policy? How should they navigate it from here to try to quell this hunger crisis?
Well, clearly, GHF has been a failure in the limited number of sites, having 3 in southern Gaza and only 1 in the north. GHF flip-flops on the messaging. Sometimes they'll say that they were never meant to supplant the UN, when clearly the Israeli government intended for them to entirely replace the existing UN distribution mechanism. So even if we saw Ambassador Huckabee and Mr. Witkoff go into Gaza today and assure the president that GHF is functioning as intended, and I would disagree with that assessment. I think GHF is woefully inadequate. We need to use the World Food Program. We need to use the existing infrastructure of the UNHCR. And yes, some elements, not all, some elements of UNRWA can be reactivated. We need to surge aid through multiple entry points. There needs to be a discussion about securing the aid going in, because my friends and contacts on the ground, my brother runs a major medical NGO, the field work for a medical NGO on the ground, and a lot of the trucks going in are being looted and stolen, some by hungry and desperate people, but some by merchants of death. So we need to secure the aid, we need to surge it, and we need to saturate the strip as part of the stabilization phase, after which there needs to be an end to the conflict that allows Hamas to leave Gaza, allows for some sort of amnesty for what remains of their fighters, and brings about an alternative to their rule. And that's something that, unfortunately, the Israeli government has consistently opposed.
Ambassador Ross, let's talk about the Israeli government. From your diplomatic years in dealing with Netanyahu himself, will all of this global pressure force him to move on this? And what might we see? Could Israel's global standing could the damage that has been done to Israel's standing in the world be rectified at this point?
It feels like a tipping point in some respects. In short answer to your question, the only one who can effectively pressure Prime Minister Netanyahu is President Trump. He will not find it easy to say no to President Trump. President Trump has been built up on a pedestal by Netanyahu. To be fair to the president, what he did in terms of striking Iran has given him extra credibility within Israel, but also precisely because of that extra credibility, if he insists that A, you have to address the humanitarian needs, and B, and I wouldn't necessarily put it in this order, but they go together, you end the war. Israel is in a position where it can end the war. It has achieved what it can achieve militarily. Hamas is no longer military. It is a terrorist organization. You have an Arab plan now, at least an Arab declaration, that criticizes Hamas for the first time, that talks about Hamas not being in control, that talks about disarmament, which there needs to be disarmament because no one is going to invest in the future of Gaza if Hamas is still able to have arms and is able to reconstitute itself, because it will do this again. So the president basically needs to say to Bibi, you have won, it's time for you to define a victory, work with the Arabs in a plan that's been developed, coordinate with them, because as Ahmed said, you can't end the war if there isn't an alternative to Hamas. Israel basically has three choices. Occupy all of Gaza, which is a disaster. It will face an endless insurgency. The cost itself will be enormous, and it will cement the isolation internationally. It can withdraw and leave a vacuum, which either produces Hamas back in power or chaos, and at some point, 500,000 people clamoring to come into Israel. That's not an alternative. Or it can work with the Arabs at this point to work out what is an alternative, coordinate how Israel would withdraw. You end up ultimately in Israel having achieved its objectives, which will be Gaza no longer a threat and Hamas no longer a threat. But if the president doesn't do this right now, unless Bibi feels more pressure from within, and I don't see that, even though he has a Knesset on recess, which really frees him for the next 2.5 months, the pressures from the far right within his cabinet can't bring the government down. Whatever their threats are, they can't bring the government down during the Knesset recess. So he has a freedom, he has flexibility to do something. At this point, we're still not seeing him do it, and I think the key to that is President Trump.
And we will see how President Trump takes these images out of Gaza, what he hears from his advisors, and where he goes from here. Ahmed, Ambassador Ross, and Susan, thank you all.